I think it's 1 in the morning. I can't exactly sleep, so I've decided to do a midnight special. I have a podcast for you, ladies and gentlemen, this evening that I've been wanting to do for around 3 years. I'll explain all that later, but finally I have all the material. The Catholic Men's Podcast, helping you find good works of literature for the Catholic gentleman. The Curse of Oak Island by Randall Sullivan. Oak Island sits off the coast of Nova Scotia, just north of the 45th parallel, the halfway point between the equator and the North Pole, about 45 miles southwest of Halifax. It's almost a mile long, and not quite a half-mile wide at its broadest point, narrowing to only a little more than 1,000 feet at its sunken center, which is filled mostly with swamp and marsh. The island is commonly described as peanut-shaped, but when I've looked at it from above, I've always seen a baby elephant, mainly because of the curve of an incipient trunk that protrudes from its east end, wrapping around the southern shore of a compact, crescent-shaped bay that was once known as Smuggler's Cove. Because the geologic structures of the island's east and west ends are so dissimilar, and because the swamp divides them, some theorists think Oak Island was once 2 islands, very close together, that may or may not have been joined by the work of men. For a little more background on Oak Island, I'm just going to switch to this account called Among the Blue Noses, written by British author Andrew Laremont Speedon, whose aim was to amuse the people back home with tales from the provincial wilds of eastern Canada. Everyone, no doubt, has heard of Captain Kidd, the noted and universally dreaded sea pirate, who lived in 3rd King William's time, when many a pirate bold committed on high seas the crime of shedding blood for gold. And of that character, that any mortal inheriting one spark of either principle or sympathy would have blushed with horror ever to think of. He bore a charmed life o'er earth or sea, no fiend so feared, no spirit dread as he. At length, he and his accomplices of crime were captured near to the coast bordering on Massachusetts, taken to Liverpool in England, and executed. But not before they had gathered immense wealth, and written upon the pages of humanity with the blood of men a long catalogue of hideous crimes. Then, and not until then, did the condemned spirit of that tyrant fiend resolve within itself, and despicably confess that he had sinned. My name was Captain Kidd, when I sailed, and so wickedly I did, when I sailed. It appears that one of Kidd's associates had escaped at the time of capture by jumping overboard and swimming ashore. Having thus eluded the grasp of his assailants, he secreted himself in the woods, existing upon the scanty pickings of a barren coast. For nearly 2 weeks he continued living in this manner, having traversed the forest many a long mile. He, at length, came to a small Dutch settlement on the borders of Massachusetts Bay, and was compelled, through sheer necessity, to seek refuge from one of the settlers, who, on seeing his famished appearance, readily extended to him the aid of sympathy. But the sufferings he had endured in his rugged adventure, together with the remorse of a searing conscience, began to prey heavily upon his system, and in the course of a few weeks, he passed from this world to meet his judge at the Grand Tribunal of Divine Justice. A few days previous to his death, he made known to his benefactors the particulars connected with his past career. He also informed them that the pirate Kidd had deposited an immense treasure on a small secluded island on the southern coast of the peninsula of Acadia. And also, seeing that as neither he nor any of his associates would ever likely live to enjoy its value, he considered that the least he could do was to reveal the secret to them as a recompense for their hospitality. But his Dutch friends appeared to attribute but little weight to the golden tale. It may be they were of that class that are not easily moved to hazard an adventure on, perhaps, the fictitious ravings of a dying sinner, or perchance they had too great a hatred to horror and blood to taste of the fruits of murder and rapine. A few years subsequent to this event, Nova Scotia having held forth inducements to intending settlers, many from the neighboring states, owing to the Revolutionary troubles, were attracted thither, and among those who removed were the Dutch benefactors of the pirate Lawrence. With others of their countrymen, they settled in the vicinity of Chester, and even one of the party had formed his residence on Oak Island, all of whom had heard of the story of the hidden treasure. Now I'm switching back to the curse of Oak Island. If one person is identified as the first to discover the works on the island, the name Daniel McGinnis is almost unanimously put forward. As the story is told, McGinnis was 16 years old in the late spring of 1795 when he rode to Oak Island one fine morning to explore it, all alone. It was still early in the day, the story goes, when the teenager stumbled upon an unusual, saucer-shaped depression in the earth, about 13 feet in diameter, on the elevated ground of the island's East Drumlin. The forked limb of a giant oak extended over the clearing, cut off at a point where its two branches were still almost as thick as a man's thigh. Attached to the limb, about 15 feet above the ground, was a weather-worn wooden tackle block that was held in place with a wooden peg or tree nail of the type used in the construction of wooden ships. Taking all this in, young Mr. McGinnis surmised that he had happened upon the hiding place of a pirate treasure. During the 17th and early 18th centuries, when buccaneers terrorized shipping lanes across the globe, Mahone Bay had been one of the world's great pirate havens. Tales of buried treasure were endemic to the region, but the legends that surrounded Oak Island were particularly ominous. According to several of Nova Scotia's numerous amateur historians, the citizens of nearby Chester Township had for years shared stories of strange lights that glowed on the island after dark. Author Edward Rowe Snow, who embraced this bit of apocrypha as historical fact, wrote that a number of fishermen claimed to have seen on the island human figures silhouetted against bonfires, as one local chronicler put it. Eventually, Snow had written, 2 men overcome with curiosity had ventured out to Oak Island to investigate. They never returned. Daniel McGinnis did make it back to Chester, according to the story, where he recruited 2 young friends, also teenagers, John Smith and Anthony Vaughn, to help him dig for the treasure he was certain must have been buried at this mysterious spot. The first thing the 3 did was attempt to remove the tackle block hanging from the forked limb of the oak tree, but it slipped off the tree nail and fell to the ground, where it shattered into powdery fragments. They went to work on the ground then, armed with pickaxes and shovels. They had reached a depth of only 2 feet, though, when they hit a tier of carefully laid flagstones. They would later decide, after some investigation, that the rocks were not from Oak Island, but instead had been moved there from Gold River, about 2 miles north on the mainland. Eagerly tossing the stones aside, McGinnis and his friends found themselves at the entrance to a large shaft. The sides were made of hard, packed clay, but the earth inside was loose and easy to shovel. Driven by the excitement of discovery, the 3 dug within a few days to a depth of 10 feet, where they struck solid wood. Assuming they had hit the top of a treasure chest, the teenagers shoveled feverishly, only to discover that what they had found was a level platform of oak logs, all about 6 to 8 inches in diameter, the ends of which had been embedded in the walls of the shaft. Removing these, the boys kept digging over the next few days, clearing out the loose soil with a pickaxe, 2 shovels, a rope, and a bucket. When they hit solid wood for a second time at 20 feet, the 3 again dug feverishly, convinced that this time they really had found the top of the treasure chest. What they had struck with their shovels, though, was another tier of oak logs, with their rotting ends embedded in the sides of the shaft exactly as the logs at 10 feet had been. At that point, the three looked up at the walls of clay towering above them and realized that even a partial collapse would bury them alive. It was agreed that they needed to mount a much more substantial operation, involving both a far larger workforce and more expensive materials and equipment if they were to go deeper into that shaft. The three youngsters bought land on Oak Island, as the story goes, where they supported themselves as farmers while making regular trips to nearby towns, seeking out men of means who might help them recover what they were calling Captain Kidd's treasure. But, as Lady Luck would have it, they never found the treasure, nor did anyone else who dared to spurn the curse of Oak Island. I find the story of Captain Kidd's treasure to be more than a little tantalizing because it was never found. Some of Captain Kidd's treasure was discovered off the coast of Madagascar, but that's all. I wanted to hear a story about a treasure that was lost and found. I began a quest for a clear, concise book about buried treasure that was located again. I searched Google again and again for a book, but all I found were rather verbose and speculatory. I roamed lonely libraries and shined my flashlight on dusty study bookshelves in search of the perfect podcast treasure book. I felt rudderless on a bounding sea of books and was convinced that I would never find the one I wanted. 3 years later, now, finally, this month of August in the year of our Lord 2022, I found it. It was at an ancient bookshop that my sister had discovered in downtown Fort Worth, small but full of gems. We eagerly pawed the stacks of books that lay piled all around the shop. We were somewhat rushed because we had half an hour till closing time, and we didn't want to displease the mysterious owner, who we were more than a little scared of. He looked at us severely as we came in, and his gaze followed us as we hurriedly went upstairs to the second level. Another unsettling thing is that there was a book upstairs about an Australian serial killer from the 60s who had fled and escaped. Inside, we found carefully cut out newspaper clippings updating the public on the case of the missing serial killer. We shut the book hurriedly and were then convinced that there may be bodies in the cellar of the bookstore, if it had one. After that scare, we came to a particular bookshelf filled with the genre of books for young boys, but some were extremely old, from the 1800s. My finger ran along the titles till I found one book of treasure stories to rule them all. It was called Treasures Beneath the Sea by Robert Silverberg. I'm only going to read one story from the treasure book today, but I definitely intend to do more podcasts on it. So here is The Lost Silver of Corregidor, the best chapter from this book. The early days of 1942 were dark ones for America. We were just barely beginning to get over the surprise blow dealt us at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese soldiers had poured over the islands of the Pacific. It seemed that they would sweep right across the vast ocean. American forces under General Douglas MacArthur were trying bravely to defend the Philippine Islands, but island after island fell to the invaders. The citizens of Manila, the capital, hurried away. The Americans were driven back until all they held was the peninsula of Bataan and the small island of Corregidor. The gold and silver reserves of the Philippine government were hidden in vaults on Corregidor. All other official funds were taken there as the retreat continued. Millions upon millions of Philippine pesos, each one worth 50 American cents, piled up on Corregidor. But as the days passed, it became clear to all that Corregidor too was doomed to fail. Then the little band of defenders set to work at the strange task of destroying $120 million worth of paper money. Day after sweat-filled day, they hurled bundles of peso notes into blazing oil fires. It was slow work. 20 million pesos were burned one day, 25 million the next, and so on and so on. The entire national treasury was going up in smoke while the Japanese army drew ever closer, but at least the money would never be spent by the enemy. Nearly 16 million silver pesos remained. By now it was early April 1942. Bataan had fallen, and thousands of people clustered on Little Corregidor. Defeat was only days away, and there was no way of shipping the silver to America as had been done with the gold. General George Moore, commander of harbor defense on Corregidor, gave an order. "We're going to dump all that silver into the ocean before the Japs can get it." Captain James Murray of the mine-layer ship Harrison was given the job. He told his crew that they had been assigned to dump something overboard. One night in the third week of April, the Harrison slipped out to sea, heading for a deep spot in the South Channel between Corregidor and Caballo Island. Dropping anchor there, they set up a small marker buoy. Then the dumping began. They made trip after trip back to the dock to pick up the silver. There were 1,000 fat, heavy silver pesos to the bag, 6 bags to the box, and hundreds of boxes. The men dumped the coins as close as possible to the buoy in the deepest part of the channel. But some nights the buoy could not be found in the darkness. Then the sailors had to guess at the right spot. Other nights, the Japanese guns forced them to dump the silver before they could reach the buoy. The buoy itself was swept back and forth by the currents, and on the 6th and last night of the dumping, Japanese machine gun fire cut the buoy loose. Now there was no marker for the silver graveyard. Only 3 men knew the exact spot where the buoy had been. One was killed 2 weeks later. The second jotted the information down, but he lost it. The third man forgot the exact figures. Thus, the silver was scattered over more than a mile of ocean bottom, and no one knew just where it was. At the time, no one cared very much. Japanese shelling increased, and on the 5th of May, Corregidor was invaded and fell to the Japanese. The conquerors expected to find a hoard of gold, silver, and paper money, and they were enraged to learn that all of it had either been destroyed or smuggled out under their very noses. "I shall return," General MacArthur had promised when he was forced to leave the Philippines in 1942. By October 1944, he had kept that promise. Within 4 months, the islands had been liberated from the Japanese. The United States Armed Forces had dumped the silver. Now they decided to recover it. The job went to the USS Teak, a stocky 165-foot ship under the command of Lieutenant Byron Hollett. On June 16th, the ship moved into the channel carrying diving equipment and charts of the region. They knew about where the silver was supposed to be. All the rest would have to be guesswork and luck. Divers went over the side at the spot where most of the silver was thought to be. They found no pesos. For 2 days, they covered the muddy bottom inch by inch within a 200-foot circle. Nothing. The next day, they sent down a scoop and dragged it along the bottom. Not only did they find no pesos, but the scoop broke loose and was lost. Discouraged, they moved a few hundred feet farther on and sent a diver down. This time, he found a waterlogged box. It surprisingly broke open when he touched it. Within were some 300 silver pesos. At last, a very small victory. During the next few days, several more boxes came up. They had 12,000 pesos, but this was only 12,000 out of 16 million. "At this speed," Lieutenant Hollett observed sadly, "it'll take 12 years to bring up the lot." Now came a hint. It was learned that a month earlier, a group of Filipinos and some American soldiers had illegally made up a treasure hunt of their own. They had found some 500,000 pesos. The Filipino who had led the search was caught, and he was made to guide the teak to the spot where he had found the silver. Or at least, he claimed it was the spot, but nothing was found there. For 6 days, he led the men of the teak on a wild goose chase around the channel. Then rains came for several days. On July 8th, the teak crew began the search once more, discarding both the charts and the untrustworthy guide. They picked out a fresh spot completely by guess and dropped a scoop. It came up full of pesos. A diver went down. "We've really struck it this time," he phoned up excitedly. "I've got 5 boxes right here, and about 20 more over there, and a few more in back of me." The boxes and bags had rotted, and the salt water had glued the coins together in chunks. A 10-quart pail was sent down on a line to the diver. He filled it as fast as he could and brought it to the surface, and as he came up, another diver went down. By August 12th, more than 1,000,000 pesos had been recovered. More were coming up, 20 and 30,000 a day. The mud was a problem, and so was the weather. Sometimes the boxes had split open and being dumped, and the coins were scattered widely. But more and more were being found. On October 23rd alone, 86,000 coins came up, despite a visit from a huge shark. The next day, the second million was passed. On November 11th, 128,000 pesos reached the surface. But now the pesos were getting harder to find. By May 1946, the daily yield was so meager that it was no longer worthwhile to go on. In a year, 5,300,000 pesos had been recovered, but that was 1/3 of the total. The Army and Navy decided they had done well enough. On July 4th of that year, the Philippines were made independent by the United States. The new government issued licenses to anybody who wanted to search for the 10 million missing pesos. A share of what was found would have to be given to the government. Eager treasure hunters flocked to the task. Some brought up only a few hundred pesos, others as many as 300,000. A lucky trio of Americans started looking in January 1947. For several months they searched in vain. Then, without warning, they stumbled on a $2 million jackpot. Strangely, the United States government had just announced that there were no more pesos left. It had been learned that the Japanese themselves had brought up a great many, perhaps 5 or 6 million. Between that figure and what had been found after the war, it was supposed that all the pesos were accounted for. The announcement did not reach the 3 Americans for a while. If it had, they would have given up the search. They never would have made their big find. Despite the government's announcement, other men continued to search for the pesos. Finally, some official figures were released. A total of 15,792,000 pesos had been dumped. The Army and Navy had located around 5 million, and others had brought up around 6 million more. That left nearly 4 million pesos unaccounted for. How many had the Japanese taken? Nobody knew. Only a few thousand, some said. 6 million, guessed others. Obviously, the truth was somewhere in between. Then a tattered old memo came to light. It was written by an American prisoner of war who had revealed that the Japanese had conducted diving operations for 4 months in 1942, using captured Americans as their divers. The Japanese had recovered 373 boxes of silver, containing 2,238,000 pesos. So now the total is known. After 15 years of diving by experts and amateurs, 1,678,000 pesos are still in the channel mud. The search is going on right at this moment, as we speak. But as one of the divers of the teak recently said, they'll likely be diving for those pesos for 100 years to come. The end of The Lost Treasure of Corregidor. Thank you all so much for listening. I wish you fair winds and following seas. Godspeed.